If you've ever had a campfire or started a fire in your house, hopefully in the fireplace, you actually know a lot more about wildfire and fire science than you might understand. And I thought of that as I was reading through Fire in California's Ecosystems. I'm on chapter 4 right now, and it's talking about fuel characteristics. And it throws out some kind of science-y sounding terms like surface area to volume ratio, packing ratio, fuel bulk density, fuel loads, live fuel moistures, dead fuel moistures. It's all these different terms. But if you've ever made a campfire, you already understand everything that I just said. So we'll start off with the first one that sounds the most difficult to understand, but I think is actually the most understandable, which is surface area to volume ratio. So if you had a big log and one match, you'd be pretty surprised if you could get that log to catch on fire. You'd most likely strike the match. It wouldn't really do much. Maybe it'd turn the bottom of that log black a little bit, and then your match would go out and you wouldn't have a fire. But if you were to chop up that log into 50 thin strips, and then you were to pile those on each other, and then you started with the very thinnest strips with your one match, you might actually be able to get that fire started. Maybe not with one match, but if you had a few, you'd certainly get it going. And that all has to do with surface area to volume ratio. So what you did when you chopped up your large log into a bunch of small pieces is you increased the overall surface area. So why would that be important? The reason that would be important is because it's the surface of your fuel that's interacting with the environment around it. That's where heat transfer happens. So that's how your fuel is going to heat up to get to its ignition temperature. That heat has to go through the surface. And then your moisture is also going to go through the surface of the fuel. So the more of that fuel that is surface, the more of that fuel is interacting with the environment around it, getting some heat from the environment, and releasing its moisture to the environment if it's dry air out there. So that also can work in reverse, though. If you have a lot of very small pieces of fuel, that can also pick up moisture from the environment faster, but we'll save that for when we talk about live and dead fuel moisture towards the end of this video. But it's not a big surprise. You're not going to be able to get that log to its ignition temperature with one match. It's just, there's too much fuel there and it's just not going to happen. But you most likely could do that with those smaller twigs. And that's why whenever I go start a bonfire at the beach, we have our bundle of 6 logs maybe. And then before we go down to the beach, I usually will stop in the parking lot. There's some eucalyptus trees, and I'll grab some twigs, I'll grab some leaves, and then usually I stack the twigs up almost like a Lincoln log cabin, throw the leaves in the middle of that square, almost kind of like a Jenga tower, and then light the bottom of the leaves. That lights on fire, and then you can put some logs on top of that, and you got a pretty good fire going without much hassle at all. And again, that's all because of your surface area to volume ratio and the fact that the more surface area you have, the more it interacts with the environment. And the more convection is going to be able to heat up that fuel. Convection is just heat going through a liquid or a gas. In this case, we're usually talking about the air. With that image or visualization I just drew, I also kind of went into the next thing about how you intuitively will stack your fuels up like a teepee. That's now getting into what you'd call packing ratio. So if you were to chop up your log into 15 strips, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense if you were to just bundle all those sticks back together again and then try to light it with your match, because it would basically just be the same as it was before. Most of what you'd have there is just the fuel, and there's not that much oxygen. But if you were to make a little teepee with your sticks, now you have a lot more oxygen flowing between that. And then if you have some leaves on the bottom, you get the fire going, and fire could start burning pretty intensely there for you to be able to put on the larger logs after, once you've already generated enough heat to where you'd be able to get those logs to their ignition temperature. You need that heat to do that. You're not going to have enough heat from just that one little match. So that's talking about your packing ratio and what you could call your, I believe it's fuel bulk density. That sounds sciencey. Basically what I'm saying is if you have a box and that box was complete fuel, you would have a fuel bulk density of 1. But there would be no oxygen in there, so it'd be pretty hard to light that on fire. Maybe even impossible if there was no oxygen, because you need heat, oxygen, and fuel in order for combustion to occur. Now, if you have that same size box, but instead you have some of your little teepee twigs going up, and 90% of that box is now made up of air, it's going to be a lot easier to get that fire going because you have a lot of oxygen, and that's one of the requirements for fire to happen. It's just that simple. Now, you can go a bit too far in the extreme on this. If you had too much space between your pieces of kindling, then they wouldn't be able to pick up enough heat from each other from their convection or their radiation. So then you would actually reduce your fire activity there. So there is that sweet spot, but maybe it's just the fact that humans were relying on fire for thousands of years. I think most people just intuitively know what that sweet spot is as you're putting your fire together. So that's your packing ratio. Next, you're also going to have your fuel load. So fuel load is just how much fuel you have. Now, what's interesting about this one is it does have some big implications for fire spread and the intensity of the fire. In terms of intensity, if you have more fuel, kind of makes sense that you would have more heat generated just because there's more potential energy locked into those fuels. However, your fire might actually spread more slowly if you have a larger fuel load. And the reason for that is kind of what we've already been talking about throughout the course of this video. It's that it takes a lot of heat and energy to get those fuels to their ignition temperature to evaporate the moisture out of them. So if you have a very dense fuel load, it's going to take a lot of the fire's energy to get all of those fuels to their ignition temperatures, and that's going to slow the fire down. The flip side of that is if you have maybe grassland, which is pretty fine fuels that's going to respond to the moisture very quickly, moisture in the atmosphere very quickly. So if it's dry out, those grasses are going to get dry. And then a fire is able to rush through that fairly quickly, and more quickly than if you're in maybe some dense forest. So that's a little counterintuitive, but it does make sense. Larger your fuel load, the slower the fire is going to go. But with that, there's always caveats. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Because there's lots of different factors that play into fire spread. So another just kind of brief example of that is, makes sense that if you have brush, so a lot of leaves and a lot of air in between those leaves, now getting back to packing ratio again, that's going to burn more intensely and have maybe a lot more of a flame than if you just had the similar equivalent of fuel in one log just lying on the ground. So that wraps up the first part of what I wanted to talk about. The next part is fuel moisture. So going back to our campfire, not a big surprise, but fuel moisture is one of the most important things when it comes to wildfire. And it's very intuitive. If your fuels are moist, then it's going to be harder to start a fire, if not impossible. At some thresholds, you just can't start a fire unless you maybe applied a ridiculous amount of heat to that log to get all of the moisture to evaporate. And then drier fuels, easier to start a fire, going to burn a lot hotter when it does. And also, what I noticed the other day, cleaner. I did a bonfire at the beach 3 weeks ago, and when I was collecting the twigs and leaves by the parking lot underneath the eucalyptus trees, it had been very foggy over the last few days at the beach, and I could just feel the moisture in them. And as I was trying to start the fire, first off, it was harder to start the fire, and second off, there's just a lot of black smoke coming off of it because it was very incomplete combustion. So I learned my lesson, and then the next time I just grabbed some leaves and twigs from the eucalyptus trees by my house, which is farther inland. not living too close to the beach just yet. And then it was much easier to start the fire, but it also burned cleaner because it was still not complete combustion because there's still some smoke. But it wasn't nearly as bad, which was a good thing. Lesson learned right there. So that's one example of fuel moisture. But you might just be wondering, what is fuel moisture? So you have live fuel moisture and you have dead fuel moisture. It's named well. You're talking about the moisture in your live plants and your dead plants. In the live plants, your herbaceous plants are going to respond to changes in relative humidity typically faster than your woody plants. And then with dead fuel moisture, that's where you have the different classifications. You've maybe heard of this before, where it's 1-hour fuels, 10-hour fuels, 100-hour fuels, 1,000-hour fuels. What I'm talking about there is how long it's going to take for those fuels to respond to the environment around them. So if the air is moist, the dead fuel is going to be able to pull some of that moisture out of the environment. It's almost like the air and your fuel is trying to reach some moisture equilibrium. So if there's more moisture in the air, some of that moisture is going to go into the fuel. But then if the air is really dry out, it's going to pull the moisture out of your dead fuel. So that's why when relative humidity gets into the teens or the single digits, fire danger goes way up because your fuels are going to be drier, and especially your smaller fuels. So that's why the ones that can be impacted by relative humidity within an hour or 10 hours. And you can guess why that would be if you've been listening to the course of this video. It ties back to surface area to volume ratio. So in your 1-hour fuels, that's going to be like your twig. In your 100-hour fuels, that's going to be something about the size of your wrist. And then 1,000-hour fuels, those are going to be the larger ones that could change even more on a seasonal scale. And again, this makes perfect sense if you've ever done a fire in your fireplace. If you leave wood outside throughout the winter, if you bring some large logs in, they might have to dry out for a month before you can use those in the fire without creating too much smoke and for them to actually burn. But if you leave some kindling out and you bring that back in, those might dry out within, if it's very small, maybe a few hours, if not a few days, and then you'll be able to use those in the fire. Now, the last thing I'll get into is, how do we calculate our dead fuel moisture? Because it sounds like there's a number involved there, like you'd be able to say, oh, it's 30% or it's 10%. But how do we calculate that? And it's actually something that I used to do at San Jose State when I was a graduate student earning my master's in meteorology under the Fire Weather Research Laboratory. We'd go up into the Santa Cruz Mountains. We would cut a bunch of plants. So I guess in that case, we're using live fuel. And then into a paint can. And then what you do is you weigh the paint can with all the fuel clippings in it. You put it in an oven. You dry it out for 24 hours at, I forget the temperature, it might have been like 100 degrees Celsius or something. Don't quote me on that. I haven't done that in a couple years. And then you take it out, so all of the moisture has been evaporated out of the plants or the trimmings. So now they're completely dry, no more moisture in them. And then you weigh them again. And then what you do is you take out the weight of the paint can, and you would take the weight of your wet fuels, so before you dried them out, minus the weight of your dry fuels, divided by the weight of your dry fuels. So it's basically figuring out how much of the overall fuel was water before it evaporated out, and then how does that compare to the overall weight of the fuel. And that's going to be your fuel moisture. So it's a pretty simple experiment. If you're curious, you could do it at home. I think I have a video on my YouTube channel where I go further into the equation if it was kind of hard to understand it verbally. But that's one of the most important things to understand in wildfire. In my master's thesis, I created a machine learning model that could predict when extreme wildfire days were going to happen. And I plugged in all sorts of different variables. And then I had the model rank which ones were the most important. So things like wind, slope, we had fuel moisture, we had temperature, relative humidity, you name it, we tried it in this model. And the most important variable was fuel moisture. And what was also interesting is that we show it transitions at a threshold of 10%. So above 10% fuel moisture, you might not have an extreme wildfire, but below that, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to have an extreme wildfire with some other variables connecting and interplaying with that as well, because it really is the interplay of all the different factors that's the most important. But once you cross that 10% fuel moisture threshold, that does put you in the danger category. And what my thesis also showed is that we're crossing that threshold more days per year. I believe in 1980, we were crossing it about 120 days per year, where we're in that dangerous fuel moisture threshold. And then now we're crossing it about 170 days per year. So over the course of 40 years, we're crossing that dangerous fuel moisture threshold 50 more days per year. So not a big surprise that we have more extreme wildfire days out there. So that's just getting into some of the fuel characteristics. We talked about surface area to volume ratio, packing ratio, fuel loads, and fuel moistures. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. And if you want to learn more, I'm going to continue to go through this book, so you can stay tuned as I continue to increase my understanding of wildfire. Hopefully you learned something throughout the course of this video, and thanks for watching.